Honorable Minister, members of the Museum Committee, Lieutenant Kelshaw and his wife, specially invited guests. This evening I want to look at the effect of the war on the Caribbean colonies, and I want to start off examining the ideological impact. When this war occurred, many persons in the Caribbean and the rest of the world, they began to question capitalism. They began to say that capitalism again failed. They began to say that maybe we should look at an alternative ideology. Many people were beginning to gravitate towards Marxism. Many people were going after socialism, communism. So the various alternative ideologies began to appear more amenable. They began to feel that maybe capitalism was contributing to the outbreak of World War I, this capitalistic greed for land. So this was one of the major ideological shifts that occurred as a result of this World War I. What was also happening was that the Caribbean was becoming more politically conscious. When this war erupted, many Caribbean citizens began to feel more patriotic, more nationalistic. They felt that the Allies were doing something good, saving the rest of the world. So what you had happening was that many persons began to feel more loyal to British, more loyal to the British flag, more loyal to Britain. But you also had persons who began to despise Britain. You also had persons who began to say, why should I be fighting in a war that has nothing to do with Trinidad and Tobago or has nothing to do with the Caribbean? In fact, some persons were saying, why should the Caribbean become involved in a war as a result of an assassination of the Archduke in Europe? So we had persons who were beginning to question their loyalty to Britain, persons who were beginning to become involved in anti-British movements. And some of these returning soldiers either initiated or supported campaigns for self-determination for the West Indian colonies. For example, Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler was a member of the Grenada Representative Government Movement. In August 1936, Butler also formed a political party, British Empire Workers and Citizens Home Rule Party. And the very name of the party shows that Butler wanted home rule. Butler did not want all this allegiance to Britain. You also had one of the returning soldiers, Captain Arthur Cipriani, believing that self-government and federation were inseparable and that both federation and self-government should be partners. Captain Cipriani believed that no system of federation was acceptable unless there was a full measure of representation with dominion status and adult franchise. So you had these returning soldiers questioning their relationship with Britain. All this was part of the political consciousness. Now what you also had happening in Trinidad and the Caribbean and the rest of the world was the rationing of food. All the food supplies in Trinidad and Tobago were beginning to be seen as serving British soldiers, the Allies. So we couldn't just keep everything for Trinidad and Tobago. And it was similar with our oil in Trinidad. Not all the oil remained in Trinidad. Some had to be sent abroad for Britain. There was inflation, higher prices for foods and services, a higher unemployment, higher underemployment, higher levels of poverty. All these that were being experienced in the Caribbean were also part of the rest of the world. Now, one aspect of this impact of the war, which I want to touch on this evening, would be the protests during 1917 to 1920. February 1917, there were protests at Trinidad Lake Asphalt Company. There were disturbances in Labre, Faisabad, and Point Fortin. These workers wanted higher wages, better working conditions. February 1919, civil servants petitioned the governor for a higher salary. March 1919, there was an atmosphere of discontent. Stevedores and mechanics on the docks were protesting. Porters and laborers at the Trinidad government railway were also protesting. February to November 1919, dock workers were demanding higher wages and shorter working hours. So all these were effects of World War I. Protests in the Port of Spain area, San Fernando area. Now these returning ex-soldiers from the British West Indies Regiment also provided vital leadership. Not just Captain Cipriani, who was president of the Trinidad Working Men's Association and mayor of Port of Spain, but also Butler, a Grenadian who founded the Grenada Union of Returned Soldiers. Throughout the Caribbean colonies, these returning soldiers came with leadership skills. They were brave soldiers. They were courageous soldiers who were willing to challenge the British status, who were willing to challenge the British domination. I also want to touch on this evening a very interesting fact that many of you all don't know, and that is at the end of World War I, Britain owed $4.5 million to the United States. And there was a talk in 1929 by Herbert Hoover, the president, who actually wanted the British Prime Minister to offer some of the British West Indian Islands as repayment of that debt. And this issue was raised by the United States congressmen in 1932 and 1939. They actually were concerned about selling some of the West Indian colonies to the United States. However, these discussions never materialized. There was a psychological and emotional trauma for many of these returning soldiers. Many of these soldiers felt rejected by their countries in the Caribbean. Many of them felt they were not properly rewarded. Some of these returning soldiers were wounded in battle. They suffered from nightmares. It was very traumatic. And some of the surviving families also were traumatized by seeing their sons, their fathers, their uncles in this condition. Many of the fatherless homes meant that there were a lack of male role models for many Caribbean homes that had lost their men as a result of the war. So these deaths, these injuries, these deaths meant a loss of courageous men who should have returned home to lead normal lives. Finally, I want to touch on the loss of faith. Many persons in the Caribbean felt that God should not have abandoned them, that God should not have caused this war. Some people became agnostic. Some people became atheists. They didn't believe that God would create a war and cause millions of persons to die and be injured. For some persons, it drew them closer to religion, especially the end of the war, when they realized that their lives were saved and their loved ones. So even within religion, the war had impacted on them. I want to thank you all this evening for having me here today.